Hi again then guys, and welcome to the very first individual car review from the 1.43 selection, and I decided to start with the Mitsubishi, the GTO in particular. Now this car is actually a car which is not so much a returning face in the usual sense. It's not just a premium update, despite the fact that there actually were no premium versions of the GTO in any of the previous Gran Turismo games, which is kind of crazy when you think of how many different variations they had. But not only that, this is actually a GTO which was never in Gran Turismo 6, etc. at all, because it's the pop-up headlight original version, and I think that's an interesting choice to make. The obvious choice would have been the latest one, with the very large lights, and of course that very large distinct grille which gives the car its face as well. Now in terms of what this car can do, it's got a ton of tuning capabilities. You're looking at a 3-litre engine, of course turbo aspirated. It is the most powerful and the torquiest car of all 5 in this update, but that is definitely offset by the fact that it is a lot, and I mean a lot, heavier than everything else. None of the other cars even break 1,300 kilos. This one is way up at 1,700. That's literally SLR McLaren territory. Way heavier than a Dodge Viper, way heavier than most Lambos. That's some pretty hefty territory to be in. Thankfully, of course, you can drop the weight to some degree, and even if you don't, you do have a healthy 285 horsepower, and I would say an even more impressive 307 pound-feet of torque. So across the board, it's not going to break any records for horsepower per tonne because it is so heavy, but the performance certainly isn't bad. And I liken this car in my overarching review of the 1.43 patch to kind of a combination of a number of the other top-tier JDM heroes, almost put together. It's kind of like the GTO combines a number of their attributes into one machine. Because, of course, if you think about it, this car has the all-wheel drive advantage of something like a GTR. It has the shape and the kind of sports car vibe that something like an RX-7 or a Supra would have. It has the more, not mid-engine, but mid kind of weight distributed feel that something like an NSX would have. So it kind of combines a lot of these elements together. Plus, of course, you have the Mitsubishi rally side of things, which isn't directly in its DNA like an Evo, but it's not too far off, being that it is from Mitsubishi as well. And of course you have the larger engine capacity that typically would be seen in something like the Supra or the 300ZX. So across the board, it's an interesting car. It often isn't put up on the pedestal that stuff like the Skyline and the Supra have, but that's not to say it's not a very good machine. There have even been racing versions of it, both in real life and fictional ones in Gran Turismo, and I would say that in terms of its tunability, it's one of the most impressive cars in this pack. You can tune it up to around 600 horsepower, which is how I'm driving it here. You can thankfully drop the weight quite a lot as well, and the handling is very forgiving. Now, the weight, I would say, is easily the single biggest constant downside of this car, because there are plenty of cars that have all-wheel drive and a load of torque, etc., that are pretty easy to drive. This one isn't difficult to drive, but it is unfortunately one of those cars where you can definitely feel its weight. And that's even if you drop the weight, because you're still looking at around, 1,400 kilos or so, I believe, even if you do drop it. Now, it's more than good enough to win here at Le Mans, even up against cars which are N900 or even N1000, stuff like the LaFerrari, which is a little bit quicker on the straights, as you'll see from some of the footage, but overall this car is more than good enough all round for a combination of straight line speed and that handling put together. And when you do combine that speed and the handling, that is when it becomes a formidable machine, because for 40 grand, which is what this car costs, incidentally making it the most expensive car of the pack, which isn't saying much, I mean that's still dirt cheap, the value for money and the bang for buck is very impressive. And that's something which of course I've referenced on the channel before, that both America and Japan offer a very good amount of bang for buck when it comes to their performance cars. America tends to offer a lot of raw power and torque for a low price, and Japan tends to offer quite a lot of trackability for a low price. This one, somewhat ironically, tends to fall more on the American side of that equation, because as a track car, well, it can pretty easily be outdone by almost any of the other cars in this update, as long as they're tuned up to a similar level, because of the weight in particular, but in a straight line, it's very good. And unlike vehicles like the Supra and the 300ZX, it has all-wheel drive, so wheel spin is not really something you need to worry about at all. The launch off the line is fantastic, you don't need to worry about that kind of fishtailing that the Supra would do, and also the fact that you don't actually have the same amount of power and torque to deal with that some of those do, such as the ZX and the Supra, means that although it's arguably not quite as fast as it should be with that kind of power level, especially given it was over a 900 horsepower car in the previous game, and the Supra after all is still very close to the amount of power that it had before, whereas this one's dropped by quite a lot, which doesn't necessarily seem fair, but at the same time what it can do, I would argue, does make up for that, because in N600 even, it's a very strong contender, because as I said, even against these N1000 cars, it can still bring the heat. So although it's not the kind of thing which will necessarily outrun all of the other JDM royalty in a straight line, which is a shame because it used to have that capability in the previous game, at least to some degree, it does still carry over most of what the people who do love the GTO, or the 3000 GT alternately, love it for. You still get the all-wheel drive, you still get the great launch, you still get a ton of tuning capability, very good top-end power, it's got a ton of torque as well, which is not typically a Japanese trait. Again, something which it does share with those typically rear-wheel drive cars like the Supras and the 300ZX, but the fact that it's all in that all-wheel drive package, which is of course far more forgiving than many of those rivals would be, means that actually it's still a very competitive car. It's the kind of car though which I would definitely recommend choosing carefully where you plan to use it, because under the right circumstances, such as very wide open tracks with a lot of high-end sections, such as here at Le Mans for instance, it's a great car, especially as far as JDM cars go. However, if you do use it on a track where you simply cannot have that kind of straight line advantage, a very tight technical circuit for instance, you might lose, because it is a big, heavier car, the all-wheel drive doesn't necessarily work to your advantage on slower tracks, so it is very much a weapon, but it's one of those weapons that's kind of like a rocket launcher rather than an assault rifle. It's a great weapon in its own way, it's got the big boom, but use it in a confined space and you'll kill yourself. So likewise with the GTO, you need a nice wide open track to really unleash that rocket power that it's got. Use it on a tight technical circuit and not only will it be more difficult to drive than it's worth, but you just won't get all of those advantages from it anyway, so you'll be fighting against the car and getting none of the advantages for it. So if you do decide to use it, I hope you have a ton of fun with it of course. It's just the kind of car that you need to choose wisely, when and where to use it, and of course against what kind of rivals you use it against also. Now I will be doing a tune on the channel for it within the next few days probably, so of course stick around for that. And that's it for this review, so of course I will see you next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.